Oi, gente! Bem-vindos e bem-vindas à sexta aula do nosso curso sobre o neoliberalismo e o imperialismo. Eu sou a Manuela Mirella e antes de iniciarmos eu vou dar aqui alguns informes. Primeiro, que quem está organizando esse curso é a Escola Castro Alves junto com a JS e a Fundação Maurício Grabois. O curso sobre o neoliberalismo e imperialismo, ele foi pensado com o intuito de aprofundar o conhecimento das pessoas em geral que têm interesse sobre o tema. Esses são conceitos que estão presentes nas análises geopolíticas e econômicas atuais e são fundamentais para a compreensão do capitalismo e das transformações dos últimos anos. Também queria falar que os professores foram escolhidos com muito carinho e temos a honra de ter vários especialistas que cruzam o debate sobre o imperialismo e o neoliberalismo, entre nomes nacionais e internacionais, professores que já nos acompanhavam na nossa escola e outros novos também. Esse curso ele é gratuito e está aqui disponível aqui no nosso YouTube. Mas para você acessar o certificado, precisa realizar uma contribuição de R$19,90. Essa contribuição, além de te dar direito ao certificado, nos ajuda a manter e custear a Escola Castro Alves. Para receber o certificado é bastante simples. Tem um link aqui na descrição do nosso vídeo. Você clica lá, se cadastra na plataforma Nutro e realiza o pagamento. Você receberá um e-mail e a partir de lá você vai conseguir acessar nesse link a área do aluno. Se tiver qualquer dificuldade para acessar, nós temos um link aqui embaixo via WhatsApp que você pode tirar suas dúvidas. Ou, se preferir, pelo e-mail faleconosco@formaçãocastroalves.com. Você deverá assistir a aula pela plataforma em qualquer horário e ela vai marcar sua presença automaticamente. Ao fim do curso, você receberá o seu certificado. Lembrando, gente, que lá no Instagram da JS Brasil, nós soltamos uma lista com referências teóricas e indicações de leituras das nossas aulas. Então, não perde tempo e já corre lá no Instagram, segue ao JS Brasil, no Instagram, no Twitter e já aproveita, segue também a Fundação Maurício Grabois. E para não perder nenhuma novidade, se inscreve aqui no nosso canal e ativa o sininho do YouTube para ficar por dentro de tudo. Lembrando que se você ainda não é organizado politicamente, deixa de se organizar, feliz e conheça ao JS Brasil. Nós somos a maior escola de política do Brasil e também somos a maior juventude organizada da América Latina. Então, vem para o JS. Queria aqui explicar um pouco para vocês a dinâmica da nossa aula. Nesse curso, as aulas são mais curtas por conta da disponibilidade dos professores e elas vão ser gravadas, mas estão todas com um conteúdo imperdível. As aulas duram entre 20 e 30 minutos de exposição. Queria agradecer aqui também a intérprete de Libras, falar que é uma grande vitória a gente conseguir fazer com que o nosso curso seja inclusivo. Então, sem mais delongas, hoje será a aula 6, que tem por tema Neoliberalismo e Racismo, com o professor Asad Haider, que é filho de imigrantes paquistaneses e nasceu nos Estados Unidos. É doutor em História da Consciência pela Universidade da Califórnia e escritor do livro Armadilha da Identidade. E já queria agradecer a todo mundo que ficou com a gente até aqui. Sem mais delongas, aproveite as nossas aulas e é com você, professor. Asad Haider, muito obrigado por aceitar o nosso convite.
So to talk about neoliberalism and racism, we have to first ask what these words both mean. They're obviously both very commonly used, neoliberalism and racism. They are part of, in a way, a common sense that we have now, especially on the left. But it's actually quite complicated to understand what these terms mean. When we talk about neoliberalism, we frequently have the idea that it is something that's connected to markets, to the idea that markets are a kind of natural fact of human existence, and that all of us, all of ourselves are sort of designed along the model of entrepreneurship, along the model of competition, human capital. And, you know, this is the kind of thing that it resonates very much with our everyday experience. But our everyday experience is not necessarily an explanation for historical phenomena. And so if we ask what neoliberalism comes from, if we try to ask a historical question about it, then we get some slightly different emphases. So, first of all, neoliberalism, I will identify two aspects that I think are very important. First of all, neoliberalism is a process of crisis management. That is, it is the management by capital, by the capitalist class, of the crisis uh, that emerged at the decline of the post-war period of the global capitalist economy, what some people call Fordism, and it is a moment of capitalist crisis that follows the most unprecedented period of growth in the history of capitalism. And this, despite this incredible dynamism that capitalism displayed in this period, we see that it still was subject to the crisis tendencies of capitalism. And so in the 1970s, there has to be a different way of managing the capitalist economy, a global capitalist economy um, that had been coordinated, directed, and that had incorporated the demands of the working classes of the advanced capitalist countries through Keynesianism and so on. And that strategy was no longer adequate uh, in in this crisis period, and it was a crisis that then went beyond economic crisis and became a thorough crisis at the social and political levels, because not only had the global capitalist economy entered into crisis, it had been contested by world revolution, by world revolutionary struggles, the anti-imperialist struggles on a global scale, and the class struggles within the advanced capitalist world. The, the, the great strikes of the 1960s, and the social movements, which did not explicitly correspond to classical conceptions of class struggle. Uh, the movements which addressed issues of um, race, sexuality. They dealt with migration, um, and so on. And this had expanded the scope of political struggle, and it had presented a thoroughgoing challenge to the existing system. And it meant that the state, the form of the state, was now also in crisis, because the state, uh, while it had previously been regulating the capitalist economy, it now had to engage in an aggressive strategy to restore the conditions of profitability. So, one kind of mistake that we can make is to think that neoliberalism is about the state retreating and allowing the market to operate on its own. That's not at all what happened, because in fact, we had a process by which the state recomposed and reconstructed the society in order to deal with this thoroughgoing crisis. So this is one level. This is one important aspect of neoliberalism that has to be understood. A top-down, state-driven ruling class strategy for managing a crisis that went through the economic, social, and political levels. So that's the first aspect that I want to emphasize. The second is at the ideological level. It's not exactly true that neoliberalism, if we look at its major thinkers and the politicians who implemented these ideas, it's not quite true that it's about markets being natural, which is actually the position of classical liberalism and not neoliberalism as such, because there's something specific about neoliberalism. And what is that? That is the idea that you have to engage in a kind of social engineering to make these conditions in which all of social life is organized according to the market. There is nothing natural about that. And neoliberals are very aware of this. The market is not a natural condition of human life. You have to constantly produce it, you have to constantly work to impose it upon people. And so this is a project of social engineering. It's a project of reshaping the society according to market logics. So when you put these together, you see that neoliberalism, it can't just be understood in terms of our feelings of competitiveness, or our feeling, that I want to make a brand out of myself or something like that. That may be a part of it, and it's certainly one that has it's an effect that exists in our everyday experience, but it's precisely an effect of these causes that are much broader. These causes which have to do with, as I said, a ruling class strategy. They have to do with the crisis tendencies of capitalism, and they have to do with a state-driven process of social engineering. This is very important. And so if we look now at the way people talk about neoliberalism, there's a kind of a problem, there's a kind of an obstacle, because it seems as though if we go with this definition, which is entirely about markets, it's entirely about our self-presentation as entrepreneurs and so on, then it's hard to explain why it is that the kind of progressive features of neoliberalism, the ones that are all about, turning everything into a commodity, they seem to be displaced by what some people are calling fascism, certainly what many people associate with racism as a political phenomenon. The Trump here in the United States, Bolsonaro certainly, they kind of present a crisis for the idea of neoliberalism, in the sense that it seemed that neoliberalism is about Amazon and about big corporations who are happy to take on the causes of social justice, diversity, multiculturalism. It seemed as though that's what neoliberalism was about. But now you have a situation in which very regressive tendencies that appear to be from the past, from a past before neoliberalism, about nationalism, racial identity, family values, traditional conceptions of gender and sexuality. These seem to be rearing their head again in a way that makes this kind of market society of multiculturalism not apply. That description seems not to apply to contemporary political trends. But if we operate with this other conception of neoliberalism, if we look at the kind of aspects that I'm highlighting, we see that there really isn't actually some kind of big break here, because in fact, at every point, you will see a specific ruling class strategy, a specific form of the state and of state power, a specific way of organizing the society in order to manage the crisis, in order to and we have had certainly our own experience of crisis in the past couple decades. And it's a project of social engineering which will draw on the available languages, cultural representations, and the various social phenomena which may be residues of the past, but can be reorganized into a contemporary strategy. And in fact, the beginning of neoliberalism, this was precisely what happened, because you don't have, in certainly in the advanced capitalist world, neoliberalism without Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And they presented a cultural conservatism. They wanted to present an image of a kind of society before all of these immigrants came and interfered with our national identity, before women started questioning their roles, started questioning their confinement in the household or traditional family structures. um, they wanted to they spoke in terms of a return to what was before that, and yet they tied this to these ideologies that came from Hayek and von Mises, and these seemingly libertarian ideologies about individual freedom. And so what's the intrinsic connection between those two? There isn't actually some intrinsic connection. They were tied together in this strategy, and they came together as a particular form of capitalist domination, because there's always a particular form. It's not automatic. And so, in this sense, we can see that racial identity, racial identity, what I call racial ideology, were part of what made neoliberalism, what constituted neoliberalism from the very beginning. They were crucial. And as I mentioned earlier, this strategy was in part a response to the social movements which had engaged in political struggle that revolved around these social relations. So this is a kind of important background for posing the question to reframe how we understand neoliberalism. And then the next term that we have to understand is racism, and in turn race. Now, I've spoken of racial ideology. I will try to explain what I mean, and we'll think in terms of race before getting to racism, even though you could say, it's a very important point, the actual causality is reverse, that the idea of race actually is produced by racism rather than the other way around. Now, what does that mean? Why do I say this? Well, let's think about what race means in our everyday speech when we talk about race. And of course, one thing that's interesting to note is that in all of these different national, geographical, cultural contexts, there are entirely different discourses of race. So in Brazil, you have an entirely different way of talking about race, and yet there are underlying affinities, there are underlying common features, which I would say are we have to associate with ideology, that make that have made this discussion possible to begin with. So, what are the senses that we mean when we talk about race in our everyday lives? There is, first of all, the idea that human beings are separated into various groups, and that human variation, human difference, that all of the differences that we have in our underlying features, that these that these can be categorized into different groups that are called races, and that these racial groups can be that these essentially biological groups, but biology is not necessary, as I will explain, that in the classical conception and the sort of classical racist conception, these biological groups are associated with particular cultures, civilizations, particular levels of intelligence, physical capacities, and so on. That is sort of the core way that race is meant. That's the way that that imperialism for most of its history was justified by appealing to the idea that there are different races and that they belong in a hierarchy in which the greater races, the superior, more intelligent, more civilized ones, um, are entitled to control the people they've subjugated. And this sense of race is entirely false. It is pseudoscience. It's not true. It's not true that biological groups correspond to culture, intelligence, and so on, but also that these groups don't really exist because the variation that you will find within a group is far greater than the average variation of one group and another. This is a completely false conception, and yet it has been the basis of the actual organization of society. It's been the basis of not only forms of discrimination, but of actual laws, of the organization of space, the segregation of different racial groups, of different forms of exploitation, slavery and free wage labor. So that is the second sense of race, in which this is real, in the sense that it's a real social relation that has really organized people's lives. So you have the false idea of race, and then you have the real relations of race, which are social. And then I think the third sense is racial ideology, in which these two senses are put together. It's a way of reconciling the false sense of race and the real social phenomenon of racial categorization and racial domination. This is the way that they get tied together and associated with our identities. Whereas our identities are not actually the basis of race. Race is this impersonal social system according to which people are categorized. We are put into races. Races are not part of who we are, because that is a false category. And even if you don't have a biological conception, people don't believe in biological racism now. Most people would not say that there are superior and inferior races, but they may still believe that there are these groups that really exist of human, that we can really put people into these separate groups that correspond to races. And so that is a major obstacle to thinking and understanding what race is and why it happens. And the important point to get from this is that it is not because people belong to a race that they are oppressed. Racism is not a form of discrimination in which members of one race believe themselves to be superior to another or oppress another racial group. It's when there are relations of domination that fundamentally come out of imperialism, of slavery, and so on. When you have these relations of domination, race becomes a way of explaining and justifying it. And so racism, however we understand it, if it's just a kind of a set of ideas, or if it is the actual relation of domination, this is what actually generates categories of race. So when we talk about neoliberalism and racism, we have to, I think, begin by having a kind of destruction of our common sense understanding of these categories. And so here, the task really begins to try to understand how racism, not just racism, but more broadly racial ideology, is part of the new ruling class strategy. It is part of the project of social engineering, which ensures the reproduction of the capitalist system. And it is also a kind of a deadlock for an emancipatory politics. That is, if an emancipatory politics is attempting to engage in a struggle against neoliberal capitalism, but still reproduces racial ideology, because you can still reproduce in a kind of anti-racist discourse, an anti-racist kind of politics could still reproduce this idea that races are things that really exist, and that racism comes out of these actually existing races. We have to recognize that is misleading, that is a distortion, and so we will understand not only how the ruling class strategy of neoliberalism uses racism as a means of social control, but also how racial ideology actually prevents us from producing a new kind of politics, a different kind of politics that can counter the ruling class strategy, because we get stuck in that ideology. So I will leave it there.
Oi, gente! Espero que todo mundo tenha gostado da nossa aula. Queria agradecer aqui profundamente ao professor Asad Haider, que deu essa aula incrível aqui pra gente. Queria agradecer de novo a intérprete e todo mundo que ficou com a gente até aqui. Lembrando que se você está assistindo esse vídeo depois do final do curso, você ainda pode adquirir seu certificado. O link está aqui na nossa descrição. Lembrando, gente, que teremos a próxima aula, que está imperdível. Todas as aulas serão lançadas na segunda-feira, mas a nossa próxima aula é com o professor Atílio Boron, com o tema O que é Imperialismo. Espero que vocês tenham gostado e aprendido bastante. Espero vocês também na próxima aula. Fora Bolsonaro, vamos todo mundo junto. Viva o JS!